Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight, and happy President's Day. You may have noticed an accelerating cycle in Washington lately. Here's what it looks like. The permanent class hates Donald Trump. They attack him as a rapist, a criminal, a foreign spy working to destroy America. Trump, because he watches more bad television than is healthy, sees these attacks and then responds with hostile tweets attacking his critics. His critics then point out those tweets as evidence that Trump is every bit as bad as they said he was, and so on. Well, the latest installment of the saga took place over the weekend. CNN political analyst David Gergen warned that Trump's criticism of the media proves he's a would-be dictator. Watch.
Discrediting Mueller, discrediting what may come out through the Justice Department from Mueller, discrediting the press that will be reporting on what Mueller does. This is what split the country apart, and it is the beginnings, in many other countries, it's been the beginnings of an authoritarian rule, and that's the larger threat hanging over us now.
Well, that's kind of hilarious. The irony, of course, is that David Gergen spent much of his own career in government, not simply criticizing reporters, but actively lying to them, as is the custom. Was that the behavior of a despot? Pretty funny. But pause and consider this seriously for a minute. Authoritarianism, that's what our ruling class says it fears. They tell us that all the time. Okay, let's say you really were an authoritarian and you wanted to weaken American democracy and impose a kind of oligarchy on the country. How would you go about doing that? Well, you'd probably start by trying to control what people say and think. If citizens dissented from the mandated orthodoxy or dared to consider unauthorized ideas, you'd target them. You'd shame them on social media. You'd shout them down in public. You'd get them fired from their jobs. You'd make sure everybody was afraid to disagree with you. After that, you would work to disarm the population. You'd take their guns away. That way, they'd be entirely dependent on you for their safety, not to mention unable to resist your plans for them. Then, just to make sure you'd quelled all opposition, you'd systematically target any institution that might oppose or put brakes on your power. You'd be especially concerned about churches, the family, and independent businesses. You'd be certain to undermine and crush those using laws and relentless propaganda. If, despite all of that, election results still didn't go your way, you'd use an entrenched, unelected bureaucracy to neuter any leader you hadn't handpicked yourself. But you'd be shaken by an election like that. You'd resolve never to allow one again. And to make sure of that, you'd work tirelessly to replace the old and ungrateful population with a new and more obedient one. That's what you'd do. Sound familiar? We're not talking about Donald Trump. For all of his faults, Trump isn't doing any of that. Our ruling class is. And that's what all these issues are really about. The speech codes, the calls for gun control, the relentless attacks on the nuclear family, the demands for unlimited mass immigration. None of that is designed to help you. None of it will make you happier or more prosperous. That's not the point. The point is to make you more dependent on the very people who are yelling at you right now on cable television. They're the authoritarians. Mark Steyn is an author and columnist, and he joins us tonight. Mark, authoritarians. It's a little ironic that these people are calling the population that while they're simultaneously trying to control the population by any means necessary.
Exactly, Tucker. And in fact, the reason they wound up with Donald Trump getting elected president is because they've got a long tradition of doing this to any Republican. They did it to Bush. They did it to Mitt Romney, who's the very definition of a milquetoast, and yet they managed to claim that he was some kind of Nazi because he stuck his dog on the car and drove the dog to Canada or whatever it was. And in the end, Donald Trump was the only guy who could withstand the kind of careless demonization that goes on. And it's interesting to me, you gave all those examples of the authoritarian trends on the left. There are lots of other ones, too. I mean, David Gergen didn't get upset when Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat senator, proposed that people who disagree with his views on climate change should be subject to criminal prosecution.
Exactly.
He didn't worry about the authoritarian temptation when the Democrats in the Senate voted effectively to neuter the First Amendment. He didn't bemoan the trend towards authoritarianism when the previous administration weaponized both the Justice Department and the IRS to go after its ideological enemies. And worst of all, he didn't bemoan the trend towards authoritarianism when dozens of Democrat legislators, before Trump had even set foot in the office, decided to boycott his inauguration, which is the very defining act of a free society, the peaceful transfer of power.
That's right.
David Gergen didn't whimper a word when dozens of Democrats decided they were going to boycott that inauguration.
He seemed deeply unconcerned. I was thinking this weekend, why is it, what all these issues have in common, though, gun control, mass immigration, particularly attacks on the nuclear family, male-headed households, the patriarchy, they never let up with that. What is that about? And it seems to me that the family is the final bulwark against the spread of government power. You're loyal to your family first. When you stop being loyal to your family first, you can be controlled.
Yes, and I would say actually that one of the most disturbing trends, there's an Indian professor in Bangalore who bemoans the way essentially Western leftists have nationalized the family. They started off by, nationalizing the mines and the car industry, and when all that didn't work, they actually figured out it's best just to cut to the chase and nationalize the family. And, what matters in any society is the intervening institutions between the individual and the government. You mentioned the family, you mentioned the church. It's also things like town government and county government. And when you have serious revolutions like the Soviets and the French, they abolish all of those. In the Soviet case, they did go very far towards abolishing the family. We've got something slightly different, as we've seen in Florida, where you have vast, essentially, you've got government social services, you've got government police agencies at multiple levels monitoring someone, and they're actually, these things are not as effective as, in fact, a functioning family and letting parents raise their children, as opposed to having doctors determine that your 7-year-old is going through a bit of a phase, so let's get him transitioning into a girl. They're at war with all the intervening agencies between centralized power and the individual.
And it's not an accident. Brilliant analysis. I always learn something when you're on. Mark Steyn, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
Well, this past weekend was not a high point for responsible political analysis, to put it mildly, following Special Counsel Robert Mueller's indictment against 13 Russians for alleged meddling during the last election. President Trump tweeted this, quote, "Obama was president up to and beyond the 2016 election. Why didn't he do something about Russian meddling?" Well, so that's a fair question, whether you like the tweet or not. But the media were not impressed at all. Various ersatz Russia experts competed on cable television to see who could find the most over-the-top analogy to express their outrage. The Washington Post's Karen Tumulty nearly won with this one. Watch.
When you look at the president's tweets this morning and try to imagine if Franklin D. Roosevelt, after Pearl Harbor, had gotten on the radio and said that Tokyo was laughing at us, to use a little less crude phrase than he did. Sure. That is not what is called upon a president to do right now.
You know what's going to happen, though, Karen? Someone on Fox News is going to take what you just said. They're going to say, how dare you compare this to Pearl Harbor?
It is an attack on our country. It is an attack on our country with use of 21st century means. And it is definitely a national security threat.
Yeah, someone on Fox News might be reasonable and subject the analogy to critical analysis. So here it is. Pearl Harbor, that, of course, was a sneak attack by the Japanese Imperial military that killed almost 3,000 Americans. It led, of course, to 4 years of global war. Yeah, that's almost identical to Russians taking out Facebook ads before the last election. Meanwhile, over on Twitter, Max Boot of the Washington Post compared the whole thing to, inevitably, 9/11. Boot tweeted this, quote, "Imagine if after 9/11 the president saw the attack as a political embarrassment to be minimized rather than as a national security threat to be combated. That's roughly where we stand after the second worst foreign attack on America in recent decades." Huh. Let's see, after 9/11, we gave up long-standing civil liberties. We invaded 2 countries. We began a nearly endless series of minor interventions across the globe that have killed thousands of U.S. soldiers and hundreds of thousands of other people. If Max Boot had his way, we would have attacked Iran also. We may still, at his urging. Is his suggestion now we bomb Moscow? Actually, don't ask. You don't want to know the answer. But let's pause and think about this in a non-hysterical way for a minute with facts, if possible. Obviously, we ought to acknowledge that Russians tried to meddle in our election because they did. But scale matters here and everywhere, and here's what actually happened during the 2016 election. According to Facebook, their own numbers, Russian-linked companies spent a total of $46,000 on ads before the election. That's less than what it cost to buy a new Chevy Suburban, by the way. By contrast, the Trump and Clinton campaigns spent a combined total of $81 million. That's not including all the online advertising by various interest groups like the NRA or Planned Parenthood, NARAL, AFL, CIO, a million more. So Russian spending did not amount to much, but it was also badly targeted, comically so. For example, 5 times as many Russian ads were run in Maryland, a bright blue state, as in Wisconsin, which was on the line. Most of the Facebook ads in Wisconsin, by the way, went up prior to the Wisconsin primary. That's well before the general election. And none of those ads mentioned Trump. Details matter. Washington, D.C., which is the single most Democratic place in the country, 90% for Hillary, more than 90%, received more targeted ads from the Russians than Pennsylvania, which in the end, as you remember, went to Trump, and so on. As any political consultant could tell you if you bothered to ask, ads like this accomplish nothing. They're a joke. And the Russians weren't much more effective offline in the real world. The rallies they organized on Facebook attracted almost no attendees, with one exception, an anti-Trump rally that was organized after the election solely for the sake of undermining the results of that election. So this was a minuscule operation that succeeded only by accident with the complicity of our news media. The goal was to undermine American society by fueling political division, and the Russians must be pleased by their handiwork, not because Trump was elected, but because our talking heads apparently share their goal of undermining faith in the results of a fair election.